El Chapo is about to snitch on everybody. And I mean everybody. We are talking about politicians, government officials, people who are still in office right now, people who spent years shaking hands on camera and collecting cartel money in the back room, people who thought that once Joaquin Guzman Loera disappeared into a Colorado supermax, their names disappeared with him. They were wrong, because El Chapo's legal team is about to hand United States federal authorities a list, and that list has 32 names on it. Now here's where it gets real. His attorney has already gone on national television and confirmed it. He said a previous list of 10 people fell short. What he is delivering to Washington is going to expand it to 32. Current officials, former officials, people who served under one president and quietly resurfaced under the next, people who allegedly protected the most powerful drug trafficking organization in history for over a decade, while standing in front of cameras denying they had anything to do with it. And sitting at the center of all of it, two individuals whose names the attorney is refusing to release until the evidence lands in the right hands. He said when U.S. investigators get the information on those two people, the entire network falls. But not one name has been confirmed publicly. And that is exactly the point. 32 people in Mexico right now do not know for certain whether they are on that list. And that uncertainty, that is the most dangerous thing El Chapo has produced in years. Because if even a fraction of what his legal team is claiming holds up, what we are looking at is one of the biggest political corruption scandals in the history of modern Mexico. Not a cartel takedown, not a street-level bust. The unraveling of a protection network that allegedly ran straight through the halls of power across more than a decade and two entire presidential administrations. And it is being triggered by a man locked in a concrete cell 23 hours a day, who by all appearances, the world had already written off. But before we get into what this dossier could contain, I need you to first understand who Joaquin Guzman Loera actually is, how he got to where he is today, and why his name can still shake governments from a solitary cell in the Colorado desert. Joaquin Archivaldo Guzman Loera was born on April 4, 1957, in a small, impoverished community called La Tuna in Badiraguato, Sinaloa. He grew up with nothing, no electricity, no running water, a childhood defined by poverty so severe that he dropped out of school in 3rd grade to help his father cultivate opium poppies in the Sinaloa mountains, because that was the only crop that put food on the table in that part of Mexico. It was a brutal upbringing that gave him something most people never develop, an instinct for survival in environments built to crush you. He entered the drug trade as a teenager, working logistics for Miguel Niel Flix Gallardo, the man known as El Padrino, the godfather of the modern Mexican drug trafficking system. Flix Gallardo did not simply traffic drugs, he institutionalized the business. He created territorial agreements across Mexico, negotiated protection payments with law enforcement at every level, and maintained political relationships that insulated his organization from serious interference for years. El Chapo studied that model from the inside. He learned that the product was never the most important variable. The protection was. The relationship between criminal organizations and institutional power was not a weakness in the system, it was the system. And he filed that lesson away. When Mexican authorities dismantled Flix Gallardo's organization in 1989, the pieces were divided and redistributed across factions. Guzman aligned with what would become the Sinaloa cartel and began building his own empire from the ground up. He was ruthless in consolidating territory. He was innovative in logistics, pioneering the use of cross-border tunnels long before they became widely documented, developing relationships with Colombian cocaine suppliers, that allowed the Sinaloa organization to become the primary wholesale distributor of South American cocaine into the United States market. By the mid-1990s, he was not working for anyone anymore. He was running the most sophisticated drug trafficking operation in North America, moving multi-ton shipments of cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, and marijuana through tunnels, submarines, catapults, modified vehicles, and a logistics infrastructure that made military planners take notice. The DEA estimated that, at the peak of the organization's operation, the Sinaloa cartel was responsible for somewhere between 25 and 45% of all drugs entering the United States. To put that into context, that is not a criminal enterprise operating in the shadows. That is a market share that implies industrial scale, reliable supply chains, and a level of institutional protection that no organization can sustain through violence alone. He was first captured in Guatemala in 1993 and extradited to Mexico to serve a 20-year sentence. He walked out of Puente Grande Federal Prison in January 2001. Accounts vary between a laundry cart and a prison official who simply unlocked the door. Either way, he vanished. He spent the next 13 years building the Sinaloa cartel into an entity that the United States Drug Enforcement Administration would later describe as the most prolific drug trafficking organization in the world. When Mexican Marines finally cornered him in Mazatlan in February 2014, the world exhaled. And then, in July 2015, he disappeared again through a 1.5-mile-long ventilated tunnel dug directly beneath the shower floor of his prison cell at the Altiplano Maximum Security Facility. Motorcycles had been staged underground to speed him to the exit. The Mexican government spent months searching. He was recaptured in January 2016 in Los Mochis, Sinaloa, in what the government called Operation Black Swan. In January 2017, he was extradited to the United States. The Mexican government made the decision quickly, largely because they no longer trusted themselves to hold him. 2 years later, in February 2019, a Brooklyn jury convicted Joaquin Guzman Loera on all 10 counts: drug trafficking, weapons charges, money laundering, and the operation of a continuing criminal enterprise. Judge Brian Cogan sentenced him to life in prison plus 30 years and ordered the forfeiture of $12.6 billion. He was transferred to Adex Florence in Colorado, the facility they call the Alcatraz of the Rockies, the only administrative maximum security federal prison in the United States. 23-hour lockdown. Near total sensory isolation. No contact with the general prison population. Concrete walls, fluorescent lights, a 6-by-9-foot cell. Designed not just to hold a man, but to erase whatever influence he might still carry. And yet, here we are in 2026, and his name is still the most consequential name in any conversation about organized crime and political corruption in Mexico, because physical isolation cannot neutralize information. And information is exactly what El Chapo's legal team claims to be sitting on. It is also worth noting what happened after that 2019 conviction in the broader context of the Sinaloa cartel. El Chapo's removal did not end the organization. Power transferred to his sons, Ivan Archibaldo Guzman Salcido and Joaquin Guzman Elpez, collectively known as Los Chapitos, and to his longtime co-founder Ismael El Mayo Zambada. The cartel fragmented internally. A violent civil conflict erupted between the Chapitos faction and Mayo's faction in late 2024 that turned parts of Culiacan into a war zone. And, in a development that shocked even seasoned cartel observers, El Mayo Zambada was lured to the United States in July 2024 and arrested on American soil, reportedly through the cooperation or betrayal, depending on who you ask, of Joaquin Guzmán himself. El Mayo has been in American custody since then and is awaiting trial. The internal collapse of the organization that El Chapo built has created an information vacuum that multiple parties are now attempting to fill, including, apparently, El Chapo's own legal team. Now let me introduce you to the man who has suddenly become one of the most discussed and most controversial attorneys in Mexico. His name is Gerardo Rincon Flores. He is El Chapo's defense attorney in Mexico, not the legal team that handled his Brooklyn trial, but his Mexican counsel, the attorney working on his behalf from inside the country, where the political consequences of everything he is claiming would land the hardest. In July 2026, Rincon Flores sat down for an interview on the program Me lo dijo Adela, hosted by journalist Adela Misha. What he said in that interview stopped Mexican political media in its tracks. He told Misha that he intends to send United States federal authorities, specifically referencing agencies such as the Department of Justice and the DEA, a massive dossier of evidence that allegedly connects 32 current and former Mexican officials to drug trafficking and cartel protection networks. He said these were not vague accusations. He described an evidence file containing videos, photographs, documents, signed testimony, flash drives, and CDs. He told her the material spans both the administration of Enrique P. Nieto, who governed from 2012 to 2018, and the administration of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, known as AMLO, who governed from 2018 to 2024. He said the people named in that file include individuals who are still in public office, individuals who have stepped down, and individuals who were politically active across multiple administrations, people who moved, as he put it, from one government to the other without anyone asking too many questions. And then he said the line that defined the entire interview. He said a list of 10 people fell short. What he is preparing to send will expand it to 32. That phrase, a list of 10 fell short, is a direct reference to events that had already been unfolding in the months prior. In April 2026, the United States government, specifically under pressure from the Trump administration's escalating posture toward Mexico on cartel-related corruption, had already indicted 10 Mexican officials on drug trafficking, weapons, and organized crime charges. That list included Ruben Rocha Moya, the sitting governor of Sinaloa, a man born, like El Chapo himself, in Badiraguato. Rocha Moya has denied every allegation and has refused to step down from office. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum publicly refused to assist with his arrest, calling the prosecution politically motivated and demanding what she described as irrefutable evidence before any extradition would be considered. That refusal itself became a diplomatic flashpoint between Washington and Mexico City. Rincon Flores acknowledged in the interview that he did not personally name Rocha Moya. That name had come from U.S. prosecutors. But when the interviewer pressed him on whether the governor belonged on the list, his answer was not a denial. What he said is that between P. Nieto and Andrés Manuel, whether they deny it or not, there were people involved. He said many of the individuals who served one government quietly resurfaced in the next, and that common knowledge of those patterns is exactly what the evidence in his file is designed to document. Now here's where it gets complicated, and this is the part that matters most. Rincon Flores has not simply made these announcements in a vacuum. According to the attorney himself, he previously attempted to present portions of this evidence to Mexican federal authorities, including officials connected to the Fiscala General de la República, Mexico's federal attorney general's office, and individuals linked to President Claudia Sheinbaum's current administration. He claims those efforts produced nothing. No investigation was opened. No action was taken. no acknowledgement was issued that the evidence had even been received in any meaningful way. And because of that failure to act domestically, he says, the decision was made to redirect the evidence north, straight to Washington. That decision to go around Mexico's legal system and deliver information directly to United States federal investigators is not just a procedural choice. It is a statement. It says, we do not trust the institutions of this country to investigate themselves. It says, the only oversight capable of examining these claims lives in a foreign jurisdiction, and it lands particularly hard in a political moment where the United States has already demonstrated a willingness to indict sitting Mexican governors and pursue corruption cases that Mexico's own government has refused to open. This is the environment Rincon Flores is operating in. And it is the environment that makes his announcement something more than a press conference. It is a legal strategy being executed in public, with the weight of the most famous cartel conviction in history attached to it. To understand why directing evidence to U.S. authorities rather than Mexican ones carries this particular weight in 2026, you need to understand how significantly the posture of the American government has shifted in recent years regarding Mexican institutional corruption. The Trump administration has made the designation of Mexican cartels as foreign terrorist organizations a central pillar of its border and security policy. That designation is not merely symbolic. It creates legal mechanisms that allow U.S. prosecutors to pursue individuals who provide material support to those organizations, even when those individuals operate entirely within Mexico. It also dramatically expands the investigative mandate of American law enforcement to examine the political infrastructure that allegedly enabled cartel operations. Mexican officials, who previously assumed that their domestic political protection insulated them from U.S. legal exposure, are operating under new assumptions. The indictment of Ruben Rocha Moya was not an isolated action. It was a signal that American prosecutors are prepared to move up the institutional ladder in ways that would have been considered diplomatically untenable 5 years ago. And Claudia Sheinbaum's refusal to cooperate with that indictment, her public declaration that she would not hand over a sitting Mexican governor without what she called irrefutable evidence, drew a line that has defined the entire bilateral dynamic surrounding this story. On one side, an American administration pursuing corruption charges against Mexican officials. On the other, a Mexican administration insisting that those charges represent political interference rather than legitimate law enforcement. Into that charged space steps Gerardo Rincon Flores, representing the one man whose name carries enough historical weight to make both governments pay attention, offering to deliver evidence that, if credible, would not just embarrass individual officials, but document the structural relationship between the Mexican state and its most powerful criminal organization across more than a decade. But listen closely, because what I'm going to say next brings everything together. The attorney's strategy here is not simply about exposing corruption for its own sake. Defense teams do not make public announcements about intelligence dossiers out of civic virtue. They do it because they believe it serves their client. And for Rincon Flores, that client is a man currently living in 23-hour-a-day solitary confinement in a Colorado supermax, whose lawsuits challenging his prison conditions have already been denied, whose handwritten letters to the sentencing court begging for extradition back to Mexico have already been rejected, and who, according to the attorney, is being subjected to conditions that amount to severe psychological punishment. The argument his legal team has made repeatedly is that the isolation at Addicts Florence is not simply security, it is a form of extreme psychological deprivation that violates Guzman's constitutional rights. Now, no official deal has been announced. No cooperation agreement has been confirmed. No prosecutorial communication has been made public. But what presenting potentially significant intelligence to federal investigators can do, at minimum, is create a channel of communication. It can establish that El Chapo's legal team has something of value. And that opening, even a theoretical one, has legal utility in a case where every other avenue has been closed. So what exactly is in this dossier? According to Rincon Flores, the evidence file includes multiple formats of documentation, videos and photographs that allegedly capture conduct connecting named individuals to organized crime, official documents, signed witness accounts, and digital media stored on flash drives and CDs. He also indicated that copies of related materials exist inside Mexico, specifically mentioning that documentation had been deposited with the Nuevo León State Prosecutor's Office and with the Office of Mexico's President, though none of those materials have appeared in publicly accessible court filings. He said that the evidence spans both the P. Nieto and AMLO administrations, a 12-year window covering two governments that positioned themselves as ideological opposites, but, according to these allegations, shared at least some of the same institutional vulnerabilities. He did not provide a breakdown of which specific allegations correspond to which individuals. He did not name anyone on the list during the interview, and the contents of the file, he insisted, remain sealed until they are formally received by U.S. authorities. One claim inside that interview landed separately from everything else and generated its own wave of attention across Mexican political media. Rincon Flores suggested that the dossier includes reference to a close relative of former President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, someone allegedly connected to organized crime activity documented in the evidence. He did not name this individual. He did not specify the nature of the alleged connection. No specific family member has been officially identified through any publicly verified legal filing. And without that verification, the claim sits in a particularly sensitive category, serious enough to generate significant coverage, impossible to independently confirm without access to the sealed file. But the fact that it was said publicly, in a televised interview by the attorney of record for Joaquin Guzman Loera, is itself a data point that investigators and political analysts are not ignoring. There is another dimension to this story that explains, at least in part, why Rincon Flores has chosen the specific approach of going public before delivering the evidence, and why he has been so deliberate about not releasing names before the dossier is formally received. He claims, in no uncertain terms, that his life is in danger because of this case. He has said publicly that he has survived assassination attempts and received threats directly linked to his representation of El Chapo and his possession of the evidence he claims to hold. He mentioned that officials connected to Mexico's Attorney General's office have been among those he views as sources of intimidation. He indicated that surviving this case long enough to get the evidence into the right hands has required him to manage his personal security in ways that go far beyond what any conventional attorney would expect to face. The public announcement, in this framing, is itself a form of protection. Making himself visible and his intentions known reduces, at least in theory, the value of silencing him before the delivery happens, because the story is already public. The calculation is brutal but logical. You cannot unring the bell of a nationally televised interview. Whether that strategy is sufficient protection in an environment where people with far more institutional backing than a defense attorney have been silenced is a question no one can answer in advance. And then there are the two people. Throughout the interview and in subsequent public comments, Rincon Flores kept returning to two specific individuals sitting at the center of the entire alleged network. He refused to name them. He said that revealing their identities before the evidence reached the appropriate federal authorities would create serious security risks for himself, for potential witnesses, and for the integrity of the information. He said only this: when the United States has the information on those two key people, everything else will fall. Political analysts in Mexico and the United States who follow organized crime and institutional corruption have speculated at length about what category of official these two individuals might represent, whether they are current or former, whether they are in the security sector or the political sector, whether their influence is active today. None of that has been confirmed. What the attorney has said is enough to understand their alleged significance. They sit at the center of the protection network. They are the load-bearing walls. Remove them from the equation, and the rest collapses. Based strictly on Rincon Flores' public statements, the overall profile of the alleged 32 includes a wide institutional range. Some are described as current office holders. Some are politicians serving on leave. Others have already left their positions. Some are described as connected to federal security institutions. Some are described as individuals whose careers survived transitions between multiple administrations, officials who proved politically durable across ideological lines in ways that, the attorney implies, require explanation. He has also leveled direct criticism at the Fiscalía General de la República, the very institution that would normally be responsible for investigating these claims, suggesting that corruption does not begin and end with elected officials, but extends into the prosecutorial and security apparatus itself. These remain allegations. They have not been established in any court. No indictment based on this specific dossier has been publicly announced. There is a name that has already been circulating in public discussion surrounding this case, and it is worth being precise about what is and is not known. Ruben Rocha Moya, governor of Sinaloa, was named by U.S. prosecutors in April 2026 as part of the 10 official indictment that predates Rincon Flores' announcement. He is from Badiraguato, the same municipality as El Chapo. He took office in 2021. He has faced persistent public allegations connecting him to the Sinaloa cartel for years. Allegations he has consistently denied. In a public statement, he said, and I'll translate, "They want to associate me with things that are not true. I am an academic, not a narco." Following the indictment, he reportedly went into hiding in a remote area of Sinaloa rather than surrender to either Mexican or American authorities. Rincon Flores, in the interview, confirmed knowledge of Rocha Moya's name without personally placing him on the new list. Whether he appears among the 32 remains unconfirmed. What is confirmed is that his name sits at the intersection of every conversation happening about cartel-connected political corruption in Mexico right now. Now here's the thing that most coverage of this story has gotten wrong. And it matters. The headlines across social media and even mainstream platforms have framed this as El Chapo snitching, El Chapo talking, El Chapo naming names. And that framing, while compelling, obscures what is actually happening. Joaquin Guzman Loera is locked inside a cell in Colorado with no meaningful access to the outside world. He is not calling anyone. He is not handing files to investigators personally. What is happening is that his Mexican defense attorney, a separate individual operating under his own professional and legal mandate, is making public announcements about evidence the legal team claims to possess and intends to submit. The distinction is not academic. It shapes what legal weight any of this carries, how U.S. investigators will receive it, and what the chain of custody for this alleged evidence actually looks like. El Chapo's name amplifies the story, but the strategy is being executed by attorneys, not by the man in the cell. That confusion has been massively amplified by social media. Within days of Rincon Flores' interview, TikTok, YouTube, X, and Facebook became flooded with videos claiming to reveal the complete list. Lists of names began circulating, some built on fragments of prior U.S. indictments. some pulled from years-old cartel reporting, some appearing to be entirely fabricated. Creators blurred the line between what has been officially alleged and what has been invented for engagement. The result was a parallel information ecosystem in which millions of viewers formed opinions about specific individuals based on content that had no grounding in verified legal filings. This is not a minor footnote. In an environment where no official list has been released and where every confirmed list circulating online is either partial, speculative, or outright invented, the damage to individuals who may have no connection to any of this is real. So why does this story matter, even without knowing a single confirmed name? Because of what it signals about the current relationship between institutional corruption allegations, U.S.-Mexico law enforcement dynamics, and the political environment in both countries. If U.S. federal investigators determine that any portion of the evidence submitted by the legal team is credible and actionable, it could expand existing investigations into a far wider institutional network than the 10 names already indicted. It could put pressure on the Sheinbaum administration in ways that diplomatic channels alone have not. It could create a legal paper trail that persists independently of whatever happens to El Chapo himself. And conversely, if the evidence fails to withstand scrutiny, if the chain of custody is compromised, if the materials turn out to be inadmissible, if prosecutors find the claims unverifiable, then what looked like a bombshell becomes a chapter in the long history of cartel-adjacent legal maneuvering that generates heat without producing fire. Either outcome will matter. And both remain possible. What is not in question is the continued reach of El Chapo's legacy. He sits in a cell from which he cannot escape in a country that convicted him under its own law, with a sentence that carries no realistic possibility of reversal. And yet in July 2026, he is still the center of the most politically volatile corruption story in Mexico. His story, or more precisely, the story his legal team is telling on his behalf, is still capable of making governors disappear into the mountains of Sinaloa, of forcing a sitting president to publicly refuse cooperation with American law enforcement, and of reviving decade-old questions about who in the Mexican government was on the payroll of the organization he built. That reach is not accidental. It is the direct consequence of how deeply the Sinaloa cartel embedded itself into the institutions of the Mexican state over the course of 30 years. The cartel did not operate in opposition to the government. For significant periods of its history, it operated through the government, buying protection, placing allies in security agencies, maintaining relationships across administrations that changed faces but, according to these allegations, kept the same structural arrangements intact underneath. The most dramatic public documentation of that relationship came during El Chapo's own trial in Brooklyn. Witnesses took the stand and testified about specific payments made to specific officials. The former head of Mexico's federal police, Genaro Garca Luna, was subsequently indicted in the United States on drug trafficking and organized crime charges, convicted in February 2023, and sentenced to 38 years in federal prison. Garca Luna was not a low-level functionary. He was the top federal law enforcement official in Mexico for 6 years under President Felipe Calderon, the man responsible for the military-style crackdown on cartels that the Mexican government presented to the world as its war on organized crime. His conviction established in a federal court of law what had previously been treated as allegation, that the enforcement apparatus itself had been corrupted at the top. Before Garca Luna's conviction, there was General Jess Gutierrez Rebollo, Mexico's former drug czar, arrested in 1997 for taking payments from the Juarez cartel. Before him, there were dozens of state and local officials, police commanders, and military officers whose entanglements with the drug trade became part of the public record across multiple decades. The history of allegations involving Mexican officials and organized crime is not a new story. It did not begin with El Chapo, and it will not end with him. What changes across each cycle is the question of how far up the chain the documentation reaches, and whether anyone with the authority to act on it chooses to do so. Rincon Flores has made this argument explicitly. He has said, repeatedly, that what his legal team is attempting to do is not simply defend a convicted cartel leader. It is to document and expose the systematic corruption that allowed an organization like the Sinaloa cartel to reach the scale it did, the institutional protection that operated not in spite of law enforcement and government, but through it. Critics are skeptical of that framing. They argue that a convicted criminal's defense attorney claiming to expose systemic corruption is serving one primary interest: his client. That the public announcement of a dossier, before the dossier is actually received and verified, is a performance designed to generate leverage, create pressure, and keep El Chapo's legal situation visible at a time when every conventional legal avenue has been closed. Both of these things can be true simultaneously. The motivations behind the announcement and the significance of what the announcement contains are separate questions. What U.S. federal investigators will actually do with the material when it arrives, if it arrives, follows a process entirely separate from the press cycle surrounding it. Federal prosecutors evaluate evidence based on its corroborating power, supporting testimony, digital forensics, financial documentation, communications intercepts, witness credibility, and chain of custody all have to survive scrutiny before anything becomes an indictment. Public statements by defense attorneys, no matter how specific or dramatic, do not translate automatically into prosecutorial action. The DOJ and DIA have both seen high-profile dossiers presented by parties with obvious self-interest. What they assess is whether the underlying materials can hold up in a proceeding where the other side has every incentive to tear them apart. That process is neither fast nor visible to the public. There is also a historical pattern worth acknowledging here, one that Nation Rise and other observers covering this story have pointed out directly. Mexico has been through this loop before. An insider surfaces. An attorney makes a bombshell announcement. A list is promised. The list arrives late, or arrives incomplete, or the evidence fails to satisfy the threshold required for prosecution. Institutions go quiet. The story fades. And public trust in the possibility of accountability drops another notch. That pattern is not a reason to dismiss what Rincon Flores is claiming. It is a reason to evaluate it carefully. The gap between what an attorney says in a television interview and what prosecutors find actionable in a sealed submission is often enormous. Filling that gap requires corroborating evidence that goes beyond allegations. It requires the kind of financial records, authenticated communications, verified witness statements, and documented chains of transaction that constitute what researchers in this field call the Grand Corruption Trail. That trail is extremely difficult to build against individuals who have spent years ensuring that their names never appear on anything. Whether the evidence in this dossier rises to that standard is a question that only the investigators who receive it will be positioned to answer. The 6 people who Rincon Flores mentioned had already denied involvement after learning of the list's existence. Those denials were issued publicly before the list has even been formally delivered. That is itself a telling detail. It suggests that at least some of the individuals allegedly named in the file have enough awareness of their inclusion to respond preemptively. Whether those denials carry any legal weight is a different matter entirely. Denying an allegation before formal charges are filed is standard practice for anyone with political visibility. It says nothing about what the evidence actually shows. As of now, here is what is confirmed. Gerardo Rincon Flores, in a July 2026 interview, publicly announced his intention to deliver a dossier to United States federal authorities containing the names of 32 current and former Mexican officials allegedly connected to organized crime during the P. Nieto and AMLO administrations. He confirmed that some of those individuals are still in public office. He said the evidence includes videos, photographs, documents, and digital media. He referenced 2 key individuals whose identities, once known to investigators, he claims will cause the rest of the alleged network to collapse. He mentioned a relative of former President López Obrador as being connected to the material. He said he faces personal threats as a direct result of his involvement in this case. No official indictment based on the contents of this specific dossier has been announced. The identities of the 32 individuals remain confidential. Any list circulating on social media is speculative unless supported by verified court filings. What began as a headline about El Chapo snitching has evolved into something considerably more layered. It is a story about a defense legal strategy being executed in one of the most politically charged bilateral relationships in North America. It is a story about whether evidence assembled by the legal team of a convicted cartel boss can carry weight in a federal investigation. It is a story about a Mexican government that has refused to cooperate with American prosecutions, and an American government that has decided to pursue Mexican officials anyway. And it is a story about whether decades of alleged institutional corruption, documented by one side and denied by the other, will finally be examined in a proceeding where denial alone is not sufficient. Organized crime and political power in Mexico have been intertwined for generations. That is not an allegation. It is a historical fact documented by journalists, academics, former law enforcement officials, and court records from multiple countries. What has remained perpetually unclear is exactly how deep those connections ran, who maintained them across administrations, and whether the individuals responsible will ever be held to account in a legal setting rather than a press release. El Chapo's legal team is claiming to have answers to those questions in documented form. Whether the evidence delivers on that claim, whether it constitutes the kind of corroborated, actionable intelligence that moves prosecutors to act, is the question that will determine whether this becomes a defining chapter or a footnote. Until federal investigators review what is in that sealed file, the alleged list of 32 remains exactly what it has been since the moment Rincon Flores walked out of that interview. The most closely watched and most closely guarded story connected to Joaquin El Chapo Guzman's name. What this story ultimately reveals, regardless of what the dossier contains, is something that has been true since El Chapo first built his empire in the mountains of Sinaloa. Information is power. And the man who spent 30 years trafficking the most valuable commodity in the criminal world understood that better than almost anyone alive. He is not in a position to wield violence anymore. He cannot move money, cannot give orders, cannot coordinate logistics from inside a concrete cell in Colorado where the lights never go off and human contact is measured in minutes per day. But he is in a position, through his legal team, to make governments nervous, to make individuals who thought they were safely insulated by distance and time and political office check their surroundings more carefully. That is a different kind of leverage than what built the Sinaloa cartel. But in the political environment of 2026, it may turn out to be more durable. Mexico has a long history of moments like this one, moments where documentation of the relationship between organized crime and political power surfaces publicly, generates enormous heat, and then either produces lasting accountability or disappears into the institutional machinery that exists, critics argue, precisely to prevent accountability from arriving. The conviction of Gennaro Garca Luna suggested that the machinery does not always win. The long silence that has surrounded nearly every other figure implicated in El Chapo's trial testimony suggests that it wins more often than not. Where this particular dossier lands on that spectrum, whether it becomes evidence in a federal proceeding that reshapes our understanding of two presidential administrations, or whether it becomes another chapter in the unfinished story of cartel state entanglement that Mexico has been living with for decades, is not yet determined. What is determined is that the conversation has changed. The announcement alone has already accomplished something. It is confirmed, publicly, with an attorney's name and professional reputation attached to it. That evidence alleging the complicity of 32 officials across two governments exists and is in someone's possession. That is not nothing. In a country where that evidence has historically been destroyed, buried, or dismissed before it could reach a proceeding capable of acting on it, the fact that it is apparently being routed directly to federal investigators in Washington represents a structural bypass that the usual domestic mechanisms cannot simply absorb and neutralize. A man in a cell in Colorado who cannot make a single phone call still managed, through his attorney, to put 32 people on notice. And somewhere in Mexico right now, at least 2 of them know exactly why.